Before today's video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the latest videos. If you want to see a case or topic covered by Paranormally Listed, then go to criminallylisted.com and fill out the questionnaire under the Suggest a Case tab. Number 4. The Olivesburg Quarry and Manufacturing Plant. The Olivesburg Quarry and Manufacturing Plant is located off Route 545 in Ohio's Richland County. The company used to form metal rods out of molten iron and concrete blocks for railroad projects. In the 1940s, a horrific incident occurred when one of the metal chains broke on a kettle holding molten iron. Molten iron, which can reach temperatures of 2,200 degrees to 2,500 degrees, was dumped on 5 workers, killing them slowly and painfully. The plant closed a year after the accident. While the building may be physically closed, there may be residents of the supernatural kind. Residents claim you can hear the voices of the 5 workers on certain nights. Whether this is true or not, stories of these gruesome deaths remain. Number 3. The Cape Fear Meatpacking Plant. The Cape Fear Meatpacking Plant was located in Wilmington, North Carolina, a few miles from the Atlantic Ocean coast. It was close to the Cape Fear River. The company was founded in 1917 by G. Herbert Smith and his son-in-law, Walter Griffith, and it opened its doors in 1919. At its peak, the plant was considered a state-of-the-art slaughterhouse. The plant could process over 1,000 hogs daily, and it employed about 200 people. One of its biggest benefits was that it was conveniently accessible by train and ship. Many people were happy when the meatpacking plant opened because the area's agricultural industry needed to be revitalized. One 1917 editorial claimed that the meatpacking industry could make, quote, Wilmington the Chicago of the South, unquote. However, it was only in operation from 1919 to 1923. The 6-story building remained vacant for almost 100 years. Many people who live in the area believe the abandoned building was haunted. In 2006, the mayor of nearby Navassa, Ulysses Willis, talked to a reporter about the abandoned factory. He said that there were many undocumented deaths at the plant. However, when he talked to the reporter, he talked about 2 deaths that he knew happened there. One occurred in 1982 when 16-year-old David L. Jones fell 4 stories from the building. The other high-profile case involves the former owner of the plant. Legend has it that the owner, G. Herbert Smith, hanged himself in the middle of the plant. However, that is just an urban legend. On May 14, 1921, Smith returned from a business trip early. He was complaining of pains in his head and heart. His wife found him dead, only dressed in his underwear, in his home, with a leaking gas from the water tank. A coroner ruled he had died of asphyxiation. His death was an accident. The company declared bankruptcy a year after his death, and it was sold to the Southern Packing Company, which didn't stay in the building long. For years, people claimed that the former Cape Fear packing plant owner haunted the building. Residents who knew the urban legend would visit the factory, often leaving a trail of graffiti and broken bottles. A female resident said, quote, "We used to call it the slaughterhouse. They tell us they hear weird noises there at night, especially when it rained, like moaning. They used to say the building would bleed," unquote. Other people have claimed to actually seen ghosts in the factory. The 6-story building was demolished in 2017 after almost 100 years of being abandoned to make room for Interstate 140. Number 2. The Remington Munitions Plant. In 1867, years after the Civil War ended, the Union Metallic Cartridge Company opened a factory in Bridgeport, Connecticut. At the dawn of the 20th century, tensions between European nations escalated and eventually led to World War I. Countries around the world stepped up their ammunition production, and the U.S. was no exception. In 1912, Union Metallic merged with Remington Arms Company to form Remington UMC. At its peak, the Remington plant was one of the largest ammunition factories in the world. The property comprised of 38 buildings over 73 acres. By 1914, Remington's business was booming as they supplied ammunition overseas. The company cranked out 10,000 rifles per day and employed over 17,000 people. While the company showcased America's industrial dominance, the factory experienced many accidents, many of which were fatal. Bullets would fly and hit people in different parts of the factory. People fell into vats of molten metal. Lead dust slowly poisoned employees. During a 1918 strike, company managers brought Bridgeport police to quell the protesting workers. One man, 18-year-old Frank Monty, died of his injuries. Two notable explosions rocked the property. One was in April 1905, where the building was destroyed. The 3 employees were killed. In March 1942, an explosion claimed the lives of 7 people and injured 80 others. The heat from the blaze set off bullets that fired into other parts of the factory and the surrounding neighborhoods. After World War II ended in 1945, the demand for ammunition decreased and production slowed. In the 1970s, Remington moved much of its production to Arkansas. In subsequent decades, Remington sold off parts of the property, eventually closing entirely in 1986. The company completely abandoned the building in 1988. Then, General Electric owned part of the property for a few years. Today, there are still physical remnants of the factory. Old industrial equipment remains, and old desks and paperwork litter the office space. Since the factory's closure, homeless people have squatted on the property. Teenagers and urban explorers also like to hang out there. A former property owner said he had police officers who essentially worked as around-the-clock watchmen. They confronted trespassers with dogs and guns. Some police officers said that they were called to the property up to 10 times in a single week. The police patrolling the area said they have noticed some strange phenomenon at the abandoned factory. They have claimed to have seen moving shadows and heard disemboweled voices and screams. The series, Ghost Adventures, explored the factory in a 2009 episode. During the episode, the crew claimed they felt an evil spirit go through them. Their EVPs also picked up voices saying, "Me, not so hard, I like it, there's something, energy, and help." They also saw bright lights, a partial manifestation of a leg as footsteps were heard. The city of Bridgeport now owns the old factory. At the time of this recording, parts of the plant are scheduled to be demolished. The building department referred to the buildings as imminent danger of collapsing. The only thing that won't be torn down is the Remington Arms shot tower, which will remain as a landmark. Number 1. The Fort Piquette Avenue plant. In 1904, Henry Ford opened a factory on Piquette Avenue next to the Milwaukee Junction Rail Line in Detroit, Michigan. The late Victorian-style brick building is 402 feet long, 56 feet wide, and 3 stories tall. It is the birthplace of the first mass-produced automobile, the Ford Model T. The Model T was introduced in 1908 and was instantly popular. The automobile became so popular that they had to relocate the factory production to their Highland Park plant in 1910. However, the first 12,000 Model Ts were assembled at the Piquette Avenue factory. The Ford Company sold the building to Studebaker in 1911. Studebaker occupied the building until 1933, using it to assemble their automobiles. After Studebaker was done with the factory, the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company and the Cadillac Overall Company took over the building. Heritage Investment Company bought the factory in 1989, then they sold it to the Model T Automotive Heritage Complex, Inc. in 2000. They restored the factory to its original state and now operates as a museum called the Ford Piquette Avenue Plant. In 2002, the building was placed on the U.S. National Register of Historic Places. A year later, Michigan declared it a state historic site. In 2004, it was deemed a U.S. Historic District contributing property. Finally, it was declared a U.S. National Historic Landmark in 2006. It's open year-round to the public, and they host events like car shows and weddings. However, as event manager Jeff Pollock can attest, you might attract some unwanted guests to your event. One night, Pollock was upstairs on the third floor after a wedding reception. Suddenly, he heard a loud banging sound coming from below. He went downstairs thinking something had happened to one of his staff down there. What he discovered, a giant steel door had slammed shut on its own. The door was 500 pounds and couldn't swing closed by itself, but to be sure no one closed it, it was tied open with a rope tied with a knot. What made it even more bizarre was that the knot was still tied. Pollock thought that one of his staff had been tricking him. The staff all swore they did not touch the door. This is just one of many tales staff have discussed from the almost 25-year-old museum. Many female staff members have had the feeling of being watched, even though no one is around. The feeling is most common on the second floor, and there might be a good reason for that feeling on the second floor. During Ford's time in the factory in 1905, they hired an all-female staff to assemble the Magneto flying wheels. Known as the Magneto Girls, the women were put on the second floor, away from the men. They were paid the same as the men, which was remarkable for the time. Making a living wage gave the Magneto Girls a sense of pride, and there was a sisterhood amongst them. It's generally believed that the ghosts of the Magneto Girls are watching and admiring the modern-day female employees. Another experience that many staff have had is hearing a bicycle bell. Since it was an automobile manufacturing plant, one would think a more common ghostly sound they would hear would be a car horn. But there's an explanation for this. When the factory opened, Henry Ford's son, Edsel, was 11. Edsel grew up in the factory and was known to eat lunch with the workers. He learned to ride his bike at the factory. He would get his bike tuned up there. He'd also brought his friends. Edsel said that every valuable thing he learned was at the Piquette factory. Many people think that the cha-ching of the old-fashioned bike bell is Edsel's spirit reliving the good times he had in the factory. Henry Ford's office was on the second floor, across from the Magneto Girls. The museum curators recreated the office so it looks the same as when Henry Ford used it. Near the window is a telescope. Henry Ford was an avid bird watcher and worked long hours, so he used the telescope to take breaks and observe birds. But when the staff recreated the office, they pointed the telescope downwards. The next day, the telescope was pointed upwards. All the staff members swore they didn't touch it. Also, there were no vents nearby, so air didn't push it upwards. In the office, they recreated Henry Ford's desk. Henry was known for being a messy, disorganized person. Occasionally, his staff came in and cleaned up his desk. A lot of that involved stacking papers. When they recreated his desk, they had all his paperwork spread out. But then one day, after returning to the museum after a time when no staff was in the building, the papers were neat and organized. Another notable room is called Henry Ford's Secret Room. It's not a hidden room or anything like that. Henry called it his experimental room and only allowed his most trusted staff inside of it. They came up with many other ideas in the room, including the Model T. In the recreated room, they set it up like it was in 1906. Inside is a chalkboard, similar to the one where Henry wrote his ideas. There's also a rocking chair where he used to sit. Visitors can see the room, but they cannot enter it. Many staff members, visitors, and wedding guests have said that when they look into the room, they see something out of the corner of their eyes, and then the rocking chair starts to rock on its own. Many people believe another ghost haunting the factory is not a Ford family member, but one of Henry's most trusted employees, Edward Huff, who went by Spider. Spider Huff was an engineer for the Ford Company and one of the people who was allowed into the secret room. Like Henry, Huff came from a working-class, low-income family. Huff became very wealthy while working for the Ford Company. However, money did not change the personalities of Henry and Huff. Huff was known for being a wild man with a drinking problem, and he would hang off Henry's racing car to counterbalance in races. Once, he was so intoxicated that he crashed his boat into the main dock of the Detroit Yacht Club. Many believe that Huff's ghost hangs around the factory and pulls tricks on staff, thinking it's funny. The Fort Piquette Avenue plant has many ghost tours and even allows ghost hunts at Halloween. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. We also have a podcast about cold cases that were eventually solved called Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. You can find it on Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.